This video is for those who are seriously considering building a functional silent compressor. Here's my definition of functional. 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, 365 days a year. High capacity tank of 25 gallons or 95 liters. A constant operating pressure of 50 to 95 psi. So for those who are subscribed to my channel, you know I just started with the Air Atomizing Aeroponics indoor grow. In this video, the information I'll provide is from a user's perspective. I'm going to touch on electrical and mechanical diagnostics. I'll show you some side-by-side comparisons. I prepared some educational animations explaining how this unit functions. I'll show you how to reassemble your compressor without a welder, recommendations with explanations of the components to consider for your build, safety solutions to increase the longevity of your compressor, and more. So if this is the insight you're looking for, then this is the video for you. I started out with the intention of doing a rebuild video. As I started recording, I discovered vulnerabilities, things that potentially can fail, and I just started recording everything. You know that old saying, you're only as strong as your weakest link? Well, the goal for this project is to have a bulletproof unit that can go the distance. The first thing I needed to do was measure the resistance to make sure the unit was still good. So here's a quick review. This was a brand new unit I received off of eBay. The first thing I wanted to do was to inspect it and to check to see if it was in good operational order. So how do you go about doing this? Well, you measure the resistance. Now in this unit, I wasn't able to identify the terminals because they weren't marked, but that doesn't really matter when you're measuring the resistance. So when you go to measure the resistance, it does two things for you. First, it'll identify each terminal and tell you which wires belong where. Second, it'll tell you if the unit is good or bad. Now on these compressors, you have three terminals. You have your run, your start, and your common. So what you're going to do is you're going to measure two terminals at a time, which is going to give you the resistance value between the two terminals. So you're going to measure it 3 times, which should give you 3 different resistance values. You can measure it a 4th time to check the ground connection. In this example, we're just going to call the terminals T1, T2, and T3. It really doesn't matter how you measure them or which two you measure first, because once we measure the resistance, it's going to identify each terminal for us, or it's going to tell us if the unit is good or bad. Okay, let's start by taking our measurements between terminal 1 and terminal 3 and say it gives us a value of 4. Then we take terminal 1 and terminal 2, which gives us a value of 5. Then finally terminal 2 and terminal 3, which gives us a value of 1. Now that we got our resistance values measured, we can identify whether the compressor is good or bad. So you take your 2 lowest values and you add them together, which should equal the highest value. This would indicate that your unit is good. Identifying the terminals. The lowest value is always going to represent the run terminal. The medium value is always going to represent the start terminal. Now the highest value is always going to point at the start and run terminal. So the only terminal that's left is going to be the common. Okay, going to check for the ground start and common terminal. Got an open line, resistance, got my alligator clips. Check the bottom 2. .3, 9.2. Check the left and the top. 9.3, 9.2. Put this back, confirm. 9.2, 9.3. 9.3. Check the last 2 terminals, top and the right. 9.3. Everything is 9.3, 9.2, 9.3. So you can see in that example that unit was bad, but that's not the one I'm about to repair. Since I can't afford to have any downtime, I removed the top with the Dremel and the internals off camera so I can keep the unit online. And right now we're running on the backup, so still functioning, just on limp mode. This is the meltdown of the compressor. So it looks like it blew a head gasket. The electrical seems fine, so we're going to give it a test. We'll make sure it's working, and then if it is, we're going to rebuild this thing. Oh, and the reason why this blew is because of the unloader valve was the old one. So it'll hold pressure once it's not being used. Okay, what I meant by not being used is if the valve were to be unloaded and then reseat correctly, then it would hold pressure. But once you're actually triggering it, it actually starts to leak from the valve because the needle doesn't reset properly. So we got a new one coming on the way, and we got a new pressure switch. So recommendations, if you're going to build one of these, get new components, even the small things. The smallest thing could lead to big problems. Well, it looks like we blew a head gasket. Here's the head. Motor looks good. Here's the crank. And you can see the piston move very easily. So that's good news. Taking a look at the cylinder. It's hard to see in there, but the cylinder looks good. No scoring. So it should be fine. Electrically it was sound. So got to make a new gasket here. Melted everywhere. This looks like a mess. So we're gonna sit here, figure it out, and try to clean it up, I guess. Still don't know where the intake is coming in, but and I don't know if this was an actual coating on here. But you could see all that residual stuff, and that hole looks like it just goes straight through. It doesn't look like there's a chamber or anything in there. So it is what it is. We'll just have to wing it, just like everything else in aeroponics. This was a complete disaster. As you can see, everything was totally baked on. How I originally came to discover that there was an issue was, I went into the grow room, I heard the feed cycle kick on, and nothing come out. So I quickly made my way into the garage, where I found my absolute worst nightmare, which was complete silence and 0 PSI. I reached out to check the temperature of the compressor. It was so hot you probably could fry an egg on it. I shut it down, let it sit for about a half an hour, decided to power back up, only to find that the motor was still seized. So at this point, I really had no idea what I was in for. So being that I was able to turn the crank by hand and move the piston, that was actually good news. As you may have noticed, it was quite difficult to clean the head and the block. Initially, I started with just a paper towel and some contact cleaner. Moved on to a wire brush, which worked out good for the piston, but not really the block. Ended up using a razor blade and cleaning the block, which got the majority off. Following that up with a 3-inch disc Scotch-Brite, which was rated for about 220 grit. That worked out very well. It took me to the point to where I was able to just wipe it down with a paper towel and I was good to go. Here I'm preparing to make a pattern and utilize it as a template to cut out the gassy material. I started out with some clear tape and paper stock, traced it out with a Sharpie. Then I used an X-Acto blade to cut it out. But in order for me to get the outer dimensions, I had to take the template, lay it over the flange, crease the edges, then I was able to cut it with a pair of scissors. When it was time to check the template, I knew that this was not my best work by far. At this point, I was already tired and irritated, and I just really wanted to get it done. But hindsight being 2020, all I did was ended up creating more work for myself. Had I had the patience, and done things properly, I wouldn't have encountered the next problem. Have you ever looked back at some old video or some photos and said, what the hell was I thinking? Anyways, I managed to get the compressor reassembled, but I was having problems, so I had to reach out to a friend of mine. I ended up sending him a video message. I left it in here because I thought it was pretty funny, so I thought I'd give you a good laugh. Okay, here's a quick video to help explain it better. So here's the crank, rod, and the piston. Oh shit, this is hot and I need to put oil in it. So, anyways, this bottom gasket, the intake reed valve is in the cylinder and it's like a fork. And that sits underneath this plate. And the plate has, two slots. So the intake valve goes in and then it's right above the piston, below this gasket. And every time the piston pulls downward stroke, the valve opens up. The intake comes from here, from this hole, and then inside the casting it has a passage that goes up into this plate, which allows air to travel through and downwards. I gotta draw this shit. Anyways, and then the exhaust reed valve is dead center above the piston, has a single reed valve, and there's just a hole on top of the cylinder, and the reed valve is just covering it. So on the upstroke, it pushes up, and then vents into the head, and then it comes down the center chamber, and then it comes out of this tube. Is that more confusing or what? On the fly video messages. What can I say? For all you non-car folk out there, I put together a small animation to break it down before this last clip. If my boy didn't get it, I don't expect anybody else will. First, we got the block and the crank. The block is basically the body, and the crank's main function is to rotate under power. Next, we have the piston. The piston basically travels up and down while the crank is under power. Now, on the downstroke, the piston will actually draw in fresh air. On the upstroke, it will compress that fresh air and pump it through. Next, we have two sets of valves. One in, one out. Think of them as one-way doors. First, we'll cover the inlet valve. It sits on top of the piston, and it opens as the piston travels downwards. As the piston travels upwards, the inlet valve is prevented from opening because there's a plate that sits on top of the inlet valve, which separates the inlet from the outlet. Now on to the outlet valve, which sits on the opposite side of the divider plate. Now for every revolution the piston reaches the top, it causes the outlet valve to open, allowing the air to be pumped out. Next we have the air inlet passage, which allows the air to pass through the block, past the divider plate, into the cylinder as the piston is moving downwards. Lastly, we have the head, which sits on top of the divider plate, and it's a series of chambers which direct the air in or out. Now when you go back and look at my video notes, I hope it makes more sense to you. Now that we got a good understanding on how this compressor actually works, let's do an overview with the actual parts so you can see the components in action. So here we have the piston and the crank, and as you can see, the crank spins pretty freely and the piston is just going up and down smooth, so this was the first indicator that it was good. Now the air intake passage runs through the bottom port, up along both sides of the crank, and through the top of the block. Now here's a closer view of the intake valve and how it sits in the cylinder. As you can see, it has a recess cut out to allow the intake valve to seat nice and flush to the block. As the piston is on its downward stroke, it allows the intake valve to open up to draw air up through the passage and into the cylinder. So each time the piston is on its downward stroke, it'll draw air through the bottom of the port, then through the block, past both sides of the crank, all the way through to the top, through the plate, into the head, and then it'll be guided into the cylinder. The divider plate is what keeps both valves directional, allowing the air to only pass one way. So as the piston is on its upward stroke, it actually forces the intake valve closed. Now here's a look at the head, and as you can see, the two chambers. Now these guide the air through the block and down into the cylinder as the piston is on its downstroke. Now let's take a look at the exhaust side and how it works. As the piston is moving in its upward stroke and reaches top dead center, it compresses the air, forcing it through the exhaust valve, into the head, into the muffler, then finally out the outlet tube. To reassemble the head to the block, this compressor uses a steel band and some pin tensioners. Once I got the compressor assembled and ready for testing, I was disappointed because it didn't work and I had to figure out why. Okay, I just figured it out. My gasket's bad. See the reed valve? That's why the intake won't open, because the gasket is hitting the reed valve too much. So I gotta cut this circle out bigger for the cylinder. See how this side's clear on the right? See on the left, it's totally hitting the reed valve. That is the problem. So I gotta remake the gaskets, and I probably should make this bigger too. Now that it was time to make a proper set of gaskets this time around, I decided to sit down, take my time, and I started by using masking tape this time around because it was much easier to work with. I decided to use the divider plate this time around instead of the block. This created a couple of inconveniences, meaning in order to mask it off, I had to cut out some slots for the alignment pins on the block. Outside of this, the difficulty was to figure out where to make the hole and how to center it. After masking off the divider plate, the first thing I did was to use the calipers and measure the intake reed valve in order to find the center point of the hole. Once I got the pattern all sized up and cut out, I was able to use it as a template to lay directly onto the gasket material itself, and then started cutting. Oh, this is a gasket material. If anybody's interested, to pick it up at AutoZone. It's like a rubberized gasket material made by Felpro. They had a silicone version, but they didn't have in stock. So I settled on this. I checked the temp ratings, and it was good to I think it was about 350 degrees Fahrenheit. So I used to use this stuff for making intake manifolds or intake manifold gaskets, I should say. Worked well, so I knew they had it. And since I was in a jam, I decided to pick it up and cut it out. Okay, where was I? This time around, I thought I'd take it a little bit more serious, and I got my good cutting wheels out. These are made by, I believe, a company called Olfa. And I usually use these cutting wheels to cut materials like carbon Kevlar or carbon fiber. But I thought I'd give it a shot because it'd give me a good clean contour and a clean cut. So I was able to work the blade back and forth since it's on a roller wheel. Also, one of the things that I have is a blade that actually is like a compass. So there's a center pin to keep you locked in, and you can just rotate it and it'll give you a perfect circle every time. So I busted out the calipers, lined it up, found my center point, stuck in the compass, and cut out a perfect gasket for the cylinder. So it'd give me a lot of clearance and give me room on the intake reed valve, which was prohibiting me from getting the flow. So after making new gaskets, the compressor started to work good as new. Okay, once I got the basic cutout done, I was able to take the masking tape and transfer it to the gasket material. So what this allowed me to do is, or the reason why I had to cut out certain sections was because I was about to use the compass cutter. And in order to make sure I didn't oversize too much and cut into a different passage, I needed to know where the basic dimensions were for the other outlines. So I can cut out enough material so that I can free up the reed valve but still stay within the tolerance so I don't cut into a different passage. So here's that compass cutter I was telling you about, and watch how perfect this circle comes out. This compressor utilizes two gaskets, the one that goes between the block and the divider plate, and then from the divider plate to the head. This is the upper gasket, so it's the one that goes between the divider plate and the head. Now earlier I was debating whether or not I should actually cut the opening to match the dimensions of the chamber inside the head to see if I can get more airflow. Well, this time I decided to try it out. Another thing that I changed on this round of making the gaskets was I utilized, as you can see, the blue masking tape. I went directly onto the flange, made my cutouts, and then I transferred the masking tape directly over to the gasket material, and that worked out pretty well. Taking the time to do it right and properly cut out the gaskets really made a difference. So this time I'm actually pleased with the outcome and the fitment. Okay, I made new gaskets and did everything, and then the lid just doesn't want to fit back on, so I don't feel like fabricating anything, and I can't find any steel brackets to shim it up. So anyways, right now here's the outlet line that goes to this, and I'm going to upgrade this section from here to here to 1/4 inch, which I already bent up the line. So now I just got to make this fit in here and solder it up. Okay, quick tip. Before you cut your lines, check your material, because what had happened to me was on the pressure line, everything looked like it was copper. But when it came to brazing, it didn't work and I couldn't figure out why. So the last couple of inches before it left the body internally, the actual tubing was steel. And I confirmed this by using a magnet. And sure enough, it stuck. And then I'm gonna just drop the lid on and use a tie down to hold it in place for now. And I gotta put oil in here and I'll figure it out later. Okay, as mentioned earlier in the video, since I'm pretty much tired of going through this silent compressor and weeding out all the problems, I decided to implement a safety feature. So here's some video notes. Okay, what we're gonna do is we're gonna take this panel off. Looks like it was held on by 2 screws. We're gonna make a plate to back this, re-screw that in, and then set a timer right here, have it run in. Okay, how this is actually gonna work is, what I decided to do is the pressure switch activates the compressor motors. So when the pressure drops below X pressure, the switch switches over, sends power, and connects it to the motor, and the motor starts pumping. When the motors actually produce enough PSI in the tank, the pressure switch cuts off and cuts the power. So since this wasn't happening, especially with the unloader valves failing or something else failing, whatever it may be, I decided to integrate a light timer. But this is a timer that I converted a 24-hour timer into one of my repeat cycle timers. So it's about 1 hour. We'll say 55 minutes to an hour. How this is going to work is the power switch or the pressure switch is actually going to feed power to the light timer. The timer is basically going to kick on. And how I'm going to set it up is the timer itself, I can set in intervals of 1 minute. And as long as I know how long it takes for the compressor to fill up the tank from the start point to the max PSI. So example, let's just say it kicks on at 50 PSI and shuts off at 90 PSI. Well, as long as I know the duration of time it's going to take to fill that up, so let's just say it could do it in 4 minutes, and I could set the timer for a 4-minute limitation and then put a break in between and then cycle it every 4 minutes. Now, even if I come up short or I run too long on the feed for the duration or the cycle, what it'll do is it'll guarantee that I'm going to have a break in between and I won't burn out one of my motors. The problem that I was actually having before this was the PSI was not being achieved to stop the pressure switch or shut off the power. So what ended up happening was the motor just continuously ran until it overheated and basically burned out. Now, by having the timer in there and setting it, say, for 4 minutes, and I could put a break in for, say, 10 minutes, then I can have it operate 4 minutes on, 10 minutes off. And on the worst case scenario, what will happen is if I cannot fill up the tank within that 4 minute period, then the timer will be on for an extra 10 minutes, which is no big deal. And then the pumps will cycle again for a 4 minute duration and it'll just top off the tank. So this is a safety feature. I use this also in the HPA setup as well. So this is how I prolong the pumps or the life of the motors. And I should have thought of this right out of the gates, and I would have saved myself so much headache. But, you live and you learn, and here we go. And hopefully my lessons will help guide you through not encountering the same problems that I'm having. Okay, after I get this pressure switch assembled, here we go again. Another issue. Here we go with the problems. New one, 4-port, all female. Old one, single port, male, built in. What we gotta do is get the adapter. Lucky we have it. On Jack FM. Okay, I don't know about you guys, but for me, I've checked around on YouTube to see what silent compressor videos are, and I've never seen anybody have any issues. It just seems like all their stuff is always perfect. But everything that I've encountered was a problem upon an issue, and nothing seems to work smoothly. So I don't know if it's my choice of components or maybe it's just the components that I've used, meaning that the compressor is very old. But, I'm just fortunate and lucky that I have so much extra parts left over from other projects that, I could just dig around in a box and find something to work. Otherwise, I'd be screwed, and I couldn't even imagine trying to chase down all these components. I mean, a lot of this stuff is like specialty adapters at certain lengths that you would need or certain diameters. It's not the easiest thing to find. Here's a perfect example of that. This adapter that I'm using is a quarter MPT male thread, double-ended. And as short as it is, I'm still coming out longer than the original. Fortunately for me, the little amount of height difference that it was, I was able to compensate with the unloader tube without having to modify it. Just a slight bend, and it still worked out, still fit. Here we go, wiring it back up. Basically wiring in the main power leads back to the pressure switch, and from the pressure switch over to the extension that plugs into the timer. So that's basically the only difference. Is the timer is an interrupt, so the power cannot constantly feed to the motors. And this is my safety feature. Here's a look at both unloader valves that failed. The one on the left is the spring-loaded one, which is older and had a bad seal. The one on the right is a brand new one that relied on gravity and pressure to seal. See this valve right here? This is known as the unloader valve. And it was leaking because there's just not enough pressure to seal this sucker. So that pin, as soon as it goes up, it doesn't return back down because it's not spring loaded. But because I put this timer in, it saved my ass again, because that compressor, the small one, would have gone out had it not filled. And you can see my pressure. It's supposed to be at 90 psi, and that's where my tank is at right now. Insane, dude. Good thing I came up with this. I'm very pleased now that I was like, fuck it, I need a safety feature. The first thing I had to do was find a Schrader valve. Then I noticed that the spring was kind of strong, so I ended up taking one off of a dolly and swapping it out with a tire, because the one off the dolly for some reason felt a little softer. If I would have had a bicycle tire around, I would have definitely checked that one first. As mentioned earlier, here I'm getting ready to modify the new unloader valve that came with that brand new pressure switch. This one wasn't spring loaded, so it definitely wasn't going to work. The timer had already saved me once because the valve did not seat correctly and it was leaking. So I think there's actually footage of the compressor sitting at about 15 psi. And had it not been for my timer, the other backup compressor probably would have blew up. Now they do offer unloader valves that are spring loaded, because the OEM one, or the original Sears one that I had, was spring loaded. But again, the seat in there, or the grommet or the seal, gave out, it being really old, so it wouldn't seat correctly after it would unload the pressure from the valve itself. Now, if it's really necessary to have an unloader valve in the loop, according to other YouTube videos, or at least the videos I've seen, I haven't seen anybody run an unloader valve. But for longevity purposes and whatnot, yeah, I do think it's a good idea to have an unloader valve. So if you are going to build one of these things and you are going to run an unloader valve, then make sure that it's spring loaded so that the valve will always seat after it deloads. So what I got here is basically a 1/4 inch OD copper tube that I picked up at Lowe's, and the Schrader valve seemed to fit right in there. It was pretty snug. Right here, I was not really happy with the fit, but to be honest, at this point, I didn't really care. I just wanted to get through it. This modification was never in the cards. It was unplanned and it was on the fly. And the only reason why I ended up doing it was because the valve didn't reseat, and this was a brand new valve that came with that pressure switch, the brand new pressure switch. So had it not been for that event, I would have never done this modification. I would have not even thought about it. But because of the failure, I really had no choice. Here I'm just trying to make sure that I got a good fit before I actually epoxy the thing, because once I go there, there's no turning back. As far as these valves go, I mean, this could be temporary. I might take a chance and buy a spring-loaded one and replace it in the future. But it really depends. One thing you got to consider when you're building one of these silent compressors is that these components are made for real air compressors, not silent compressors. So the motor capacity, the volume, the PSI rates, all that is completely different. All I know is I need something very reliable. Mine's in operation 24/7, 365. For those following me, you guys know I'm using this for Air Atomizing Aeroponics. Here we have the valve body, the pressure tube, and the compression nut that holds the pressure tube to the valve body. Once the pressure switch triggers the lever to raise the needle, it releases all the excess pressure built up in the unloader valve. The issue I had with the new unloader valve, which came with the new pressure switch, was it was not spring loaded, first and foremost. Secondly, occasionally after it would unload, it would not seat correctly. My older unloader valve was spring loaded, but it had a bad seal. So either way, both valve bodies would actually cause constant bleeding, never turning off the pressure switch, therefore making the motors run until they burn up. So I took the new unloader valve and converted it over to a Schrader valve, which is spring loaded. On top of that, I decided to add a safety feature in, which I put a timer in to limit the duration of any one given cycle so that the motors will not overheat. And you'll see all this in the video. If you're wondering why it's important to have a spring-loaded unloader valve for your silent compressor, it's because initially the compressors just don't have the capacity or the PSI to forcefully close the valve upon startup. So you need that thing seated and sealed so you don't have a leak, and so that the pressure signal will get to the pressure switch and the pressure switch will cut off the motors accordingly. When I first started this project, I didn't really think it through. The only thing I had in my mind was seeing if I can actually rebuild it. When it came to reassembly, I didn't really worry about the details because whatever it took, whatever fabrication it took, I was confident I would be able to pull it off. A couple of reasons why I opted to use silicone to reassemble the unit. First was when I was doing the pressure line, the tube itself, a portion of it was copper, and then at the very end it transitioned into steel. So I had a hell of a time trying to braze the two together. It just wouldn't work, and ultimately led into a bad fitment situation. Next, because of everything that I've endured and had to go through to get to this point, I've learned so much, and once I feel confident that this thing is pretty bulletproof, I actually am planning to go back in and do the high performance thing. So I'll go into the motor and modify the motor to get higher performance and higher flow out of it. So for that reason, I wanted to keep it accessible, not to mention some of the other simple mods that I would like to do in the future, like add an oil drain plug, just keeping that convenient. Now, if you're wondering what I'm doing here, well, the silicone that I applied directly to the motor itself did not cure. I waited 2.5 days and the thing was still wet. So I decided to go back and do this thing called Proto Putty. I don't know if you guys are familiar with it, but it's a really simple formula. Basically, use 100% silicone, get some cornstarch and some food coloring. Mix the food coloring and the silicone thoroughly until you get like a solid color. Once you achieve that, then you can start adding in your cornstarch to make it non-stick. You want to knead it in thoroughly so that you can get it to a tacky point, tacky to the touch. Once this is achieved, you got about 5 to 10 minutes to apply the silicone to whatever the application you're going to use. Okay, it's 9:30. And I just got done making this gasket, this green one this time. And I did it how I made the other gaskets. It's called Proto Putty. Mix it with food coloring and cornstarch, and the shit cures in like, I don't know, it'll cure in 24 hours, but for sure. But this is pretty rubbery already. It's not sticky, it's not liquidy. And then I had a little bit of extra, and this thing, when this compressor's on, this wood board vibrates because it's on hard plastic. So the hard plastic makes everything rigid, but it vibrates. So I took the extra and I made some little grommets. They're not even, but oh well, it'll do. So these will be my little bushings, and hopefully that'll silence it up. But my wood's all f***ed up because it's all oily now. compared to the back. You can see the oil stains. It's all dark right there. But got a lot of shit to do. Tired of dealing with this one. Just want it to work. But this timer, man, has saved me already a couple times. So that's fucking bomb shit. And I need to add one in for the I have it for the Aero, but now I need to add one in for that flood and drain DWC version. So I need to add one of these so that it doesn't run for 15 minutes straight, because it'll blow up my solenoid. So I'm just gonna make it run for like 5 minutes or something, and let it do that. Time to go in, man. Okay, here I used a couple of long hose clamps to clamp down the lid and keep it secure, and I zip tied them together so they wouldn't slide off the housing.